Here's something I keep coming back to. When a movement built around power, faith, and national destiny starts to lose a little bit, like in Hungary, in Washington, even among its own allies, the instinct among us is to call that a correction. But power corrections don't work that way. Power doesn't disappear, it just relocates. Tonight, we're tracing where that power is going and mapping the institutions that are supposed to stop it from landing someplace even worse than where it is right now. That's what we're taking a look at today on Liberty Lens. And to help me with this, what I'm afraid to say, Mike, we've been avoiding this topic because it can be a little bit touchy, but I think it's time we talked about it given world events. Everyone, Mr. Mike Termott, and we're going to talk about nationalism in general, Mike, and perhaps Christian nationalism in particular.
Yes, we have been avoiding it, and I think we have been avoiding it because one of the things I enjoy about doing these episodes with you, John, is that we don't talk too much about them in advance, right? We kibitz about what kind of topic, and then, you put a little outline together and some notes, and, maybe I'll send some notes back and forth. But we don't try to get each other to agree on anything, even to the point of how you're going to characterize it when you open it. Every week when you open it, it's a little bit of education for me, a little bit of insight into how you see things and think, and a little bit of a surprise. And I really enjoyed what you just said. We're going to talk about nationalism and maybe a little bit about Christian nationalism in particular. I thought you were going to say, we're going to talk about Christian nationalism and maybe a little bit of nationalism, a little bit more broadly. But obviously, they go hand in hand.
Right.
And the way I see this, and by the way, I think you and I totally agree that this is an important topic and one that we can no longer avoid, right? As much as we may work at, as much as a good Lutheran and a good Greek Orthodox kid can avoid these, it's going to be hard to avoid this topic now that, Trump and the Pope have kibitzed a little bit in public. And I think that the American government has done a couple of dumb things, and we need to talk about Viktor Orban. And there's a lot to talk about, right? You can't avoid it. But the way that I see this is Christianity on the one hand and Christian nationalism on the other. And I think that we need to tease those two things out apart from each other, as I see Christian nationalism as a political movement and Christianity not having a lot to do with that.
Right.
And one of the reasons I see it that way is because I see a lot of fakery, as I think you do, right? In the Christian nationalist movement, I see a lot of fakery that doesn't remind me all that much of Christianity.
Right.
Right. They overlap. I don't mean that, there's not overlap, but it doesn't rhyme. It's just a little bit of overlap. And I think that one of the constant themes that you and I come back to is that people don't handle politics very well sometimes, whether they're well-meaning or not well-meaning, right? One of the things we always say is I think President Trump gets crappy staff work. I think he's surrounded by people that are nincompoops. However you feel about President Trump, I think he gets some things right and some things wrong. But I think his staff is almost uniformly bad at their jobs. Right. Rarely do I say, oh, he really got good staff work this week. That doesn't happen too often. And one of the things I would say about Christian nationalism is that it does a really crappy job of advancing the principles of Christianity.
Right.
And that's too bad. And given that, we'll talk about that. I don't mean to say it's given and, we all need to accept that as truth just because I asserted it. But if you believe that it does that, then I think we're obliged to recognize that some people who would use Christian nationalism
Right.
to advance their cause, right?
Mm.
I don't think it's necessary. If I were an advisor to some jerk who wants to manipulate Christians into supporting him by adopting some weird form of Christian nationalism,
Right.
I would tell him to go about it very differently than they do.
Right. And to your point, I think what you're trying to say, and I know, I'll admit this because, like, a lot of times people kind of peg me as being anti-religion or anti-Christian or whatever. And while I understand why a lot of people would feel that way, that's not necessarily the truth. What I am opposed to starts out with the collectivism more so than anything else, right? So to me, uh, we start out with the concept of nationalism, which is just another form of collectivism. As libertarians, as individualists, as people who believe in liberal institutions, that in itself is a warning flag. So, by the way, nationalism can have a lot of different names, right? It could be patriotism. If you have the wrong definition of patriotism floating around your head, that very easily conflates with nationalism, and we've seen that in the past, right? Where nationalism is the goal, Mike, but you're not a good American if you don't support the war. You're not a good American if you don't support anti-drug laws, right? So the nationalism really just means allegiance to the collective above allegiance to individuals, right?
Yep.
How the mechanisms you use to get there to me are always fascinating. Nationalism, I think, naturally lends itself to use patriotism to advance its own goals, right? And we've seen that in not just the US, but all over the world. What's interesting to me, and we can tease this out more, is that MAGA, President Trump, um, Project 2025, a lot of these thought leadership groups and political groups, they are continuing their habit of resorting to 17th century politics and identity to once again get that nationalism going, right? So in the 17th century, to go along with President Trump's mercantilism, uh, what did you have back then? You had sovereigns, you had divine rulers who got their authority through divine sourcing, right? Whether it was kings, emperors, whatever. And you're kind of seeing it now. Where does a lot of MAGA in the US get its authority? Well, they're aligned with Jesus. They're aligned with Jesus Christ because they're doing his work. Jesus Christ clearly prefers MAGA Republicans to Democrats. That's what you get from the movement here. In Hungary, Viktor Orban's group used the Christian/white nationalism to foster that national identity and until recently hold a tight grip on power. In Russia, we see how Vladimir Putin has used the Russian Orthodox Church as a conduit to help keep his hold on power because it's giving them a national identity. So to me, that seems to be the issue, right? Is the understanding that, and we could break it down piece by piece, but that's sort of like my framework that you
Yep.
have nationalism, which is to me the greater danger, and then how that nationalism is propped up right now, just in the US, happens to be Christianity. It happens maybe as a close second to be the white nationalism, but everything always has nationalism. There's an adjective and then nationalism. And I think in my they're closely intertwined, but that to me is the real issue.
I don't disagree with that. Um, I think that there is a risk of overstating the extent to which for example, the MAGA movement representing Christian interests. I just don't think it does that. Um, I think that the Republican Party, writ more broadly, draws sufficient distinction against the principles and values of the Democratic Party, such that most Christians are going to migrate to the Republican Party.
Fair enough.
The big issue being abortion, right? the big issue. And by the way, you had mentioned that some people have accused you of being, anti-religion. I've never picked up on that, and shame on anyone who would suggest that. Uh, I am very pro-religion, and I have been accused of such.
Mm.
I'm okay with that. As I do consider myself a libertarian still, and always will, I think, and probably always have. I think that the big distinction that we need to draw is between, at the moment, for the purpose of this conversation, I want to draw a bright line distinction between Christianity and Christian nationalism. And by that, what I mean is, as a Christian, look, I was raised by a Lutheran and by a Calvinist. I grew up not only in a family of faith, but believing in a healthy dose of predestination, meaning it's up to us to find our path. That your relationship with God is personal, that God is looking out for you, and your life is to be dedicated to service of Him.
Mm.
It is very much a personal relationship. It is not a relationship between God and government. And this idea of there being a relationship between you and government that matters is not even on the radar screen, right?
Mm.
To your point, liberty comes from our Maker, or I truly believe you don't need to be a person of faith to recognize that liberty is a personal issue,
Right.
and that correctly defined and structured, government gets its power from the individual, not the other way around. And that's why so many of the founders believed it was important that we be people of faith, so that we recognize that our power comes from a higher authority. I concur with that, but I do believe that a person of faith can believe in exactly the same tenets as a matter of political philosophy, and should.
Right.
So coming from that place and having, been in and out of evangelical churches and Catholic churches my whole life, and having raised my kids in the same vein, I think it's important for Christians to recapture the political conversation, which is to say, we are called to share our faith, but in the secular context, that's no less important. We are called to share our principles of, all the things that surround faith, that come from that faith, even if in a secular context you're not talking about faith every day, but principles of service and humility, which we could use some more of, and the idea of us all being children of God. In a secular context, that means believing in individual humanity for everyone
Right.
on a level playing field. And you can advance these principles without advancing the identity politics of, well, you're a Christian, so you ought to have more influence in your government than someone who's not a Christian.
Right.
In some sense, I see the distinction as being, Christians want to advance the principles and the faith in a non-secular context, right? Christians are called to share our faith. And in a political context, we should be advancing these principles. Christian nationalism is an identity politics that
Yes.
says the people who believe like I do, or to your point, white nationalists, people who look like I do, or who have DNA or biology
Right.
like I do, or a surname like I do, or whatever class or group of people you're talking about.
Right.
If, as you said, some adjective followed by the word nationalism, it's an identity politics that says people who are in my favorite group are the ones that ought to have more influence, whether in a cultural sense or in a political sense, ought to have more power.
Right.
And you're right that these politicians are leveraging these ideas to stay in power. But I would be careful. I'm interested in your reaction to this. I would be careful to avoid overstating the extent to which they came to power because of.
I got you. I think I
Yeah,
know what you're trying to say. Yeah,
yeah. To overstate, an obvious example.
sure.
President Trump did not come to power because everyone believed he was the best Christian in America.
Agreed. Agreed.
And he wouldn't assert that he was. He's not trying to, right?
Well, that's where I would push. See, this is where I think maybe we not diverge, but maybe it's a matter of degree. Because while I agree, especially for people who knew Trump as a businessman, nobody came here and said, this guy's the world's greatest Christian. If I'm a Christian, I'm voting for Trump because he's a Christian. I
Right.
don't think
That would have been insane.
that would have been insane initially. But I think over the course of the last 12 years or so, to me, it's very obvious what's been happening vis-a-vis Trump and his relationship to religion and specifically Christianity. For example, everyone remembers the comical ways Trump used to refer to religion, to Christianity. He would quote Bible verses incorrectly. He'd make up Bible
Yes, and not just technically incorrectly, but culture. I mean, like
verses.
he wasn't even comfortable with the style with which
Like
people referenced Bible verses,
right. Instead of saying John 3:16, he would say John.
Christian or Jewish.
Right, right. Just from the cultural, even how
Right,
you say John 3:16. Everyone knows, from the guy holding up the sign in the football games and everything. Right? He would say John dot dot 16 or 16 dot dot. He would
right.
always. It was a malapropism after malapropism. So everyone knew he was a 100% secular guy. The famous picture of him holding the Bible upside down at some rally or something like that. So we all knew that. But now,
And let me back you up there and emphasize your point. A Christian wouldn't have been standing there holding up the Bible, and certainly not a libertarian.
right,
Which
right,
is why I think there is so much overlap between a libertarian, right, who stands up for your individual liberty,
right.
and a Christian who recognizes that it's an individual relationship that he has with God.
Right.
And this whole idea of holding up the Bible in the first place, it's just funnier when it's upside down.
Exactly. It's just one mental image after another that tells you this guy has no relationship, in my opinion, with God, religion, or anything else. But look at what's happening now. He makes a point of having what seems to be regularly scheduled photo ops with all the. And again, to someone who comes from an Orthodox faith, this is a totally foreign concept to me. Where Trump is sitting in a chair and there's 50 pairs of hands on him and stuff, laying hands on
Right,
things.
right.
So, like, he makes a point of taking those pictures. Not to mention that horrific, contextually speaking, after his beef with Pope Leo, um, that horrific, tasteless picture of him as Jesus healing the nation with like bombers flying overhead and some sort of winged power creature. It was like one of the most disgusting, in my opinion, uses of religious
Cringy.
iconography to put across a non-religious, non-Christian point. And I think this is where I have the largest disdain possible, because when you look at someone like a Bannon, when you look at a lot of what Project 2025's goals are, they are merely Sebastian Gorka might be one of these guys. Now, I'm not here to tell you what they actually believe. I'm not here to
Right,
criticize their religious beliefs.
right.
But their use of Christianity to further nationalist goals, to me, is disgusting. And you're dealing with two incompatible pieces, in my opinion. One, you have religion, which, as you said, I think very eloquently, is a matter of a personal relationship with God. And inherently, religion is a matter of faith. And the reason nationalists love using something like religion, much like QAnon, it can never be disproven, right? Like, there's nothing, if you're a man of faith, if you're a person of faith, whatever the faith may be, we all know that science is not going to change your mind. right? It's a matter of faith. Whatever drove you to hold those beliefs, you hold them because they are deeply personally held beliefs to you, right? Whereas everything else in nationalism, I could challenge you. These tariffs cause inflation. This war is senseless. This many people were killed as a result of this governmental action. These things have receipts. You can hopefully logic your way through them with your
Yeah.
opponent.
Yep.
Can't do that with faith, right? What's the point of me arguing, if I'm a Christian, arguing with a Jewish person or a Muslim person or a Buddhist or a Taoist or a Jainist, right? Like, these are matters of faith. Hopefully we can get along. Hopefully we'll find common ground, which most major religions do accord, believe it or not. There's a lot of
Yep.
people who say that a lot of them are incompatible. Most of them are compatible,
Yep.
especially with their major tenets.
Yep.
That to me is the bright line, Mike, is that the despicable practice of using a faith-based and, let's face it, illiberal construct like religion to justify government, to justify nationalist government,
Yep.
collective government.
Yep.
We're picking on nationalism. Communism went the other route. They basically said the state is your religion. You are to have no faith in anything other than the proletariat, right? They went a different route. Nationalism kind of goes, it's co-opting something that, to your point, should be deeply personal. And that's my beef with it. And that's the danger. Because like I said, you can't logic your way out of someone who has a faith held position. There's no amount of talking. And I see that sort of fervor, or used to, and I think this is where we turned the conversation a little bit. I used to see that fervor in MAGA.
I get that, and I think that the people in MAGA, people in the Republican Party more generally, are, to say something banal, just as Christian as they ever were, right?
Right.
Um, what I see is, how do I say this? If you're trying to manipulate someone into voting for you by saying you're Christian, I'm Christian, we're Christian nationalists, this is identity politics, don't vote for a Muslim, don't vote for a Jew, vote for a Christian, vote for me, right? If that's your shtick, and to a certain extent it is for some of these politicians we're
Sure.
discussing, right? If that's your shtick, if you're in the Democratic Party, you're not getting a lot of traction. But you do get quite a bit of open field running in the Republican Party.
To a certain run up, I agree with you. Yeah.
And I don't think that that's because one party or the other is more given to identity politics. It would be hard to say the reason that is because Republicans are all about identity politics and Democrats aren't. That would
No,
be a hard argument to sustain, right?
no,
So, so I don't think it's that. I think that Republicans are particularly vulnerable to Christian nationalism, where the Democrats may be vulnerable to other forms of nationalism.
sure. The DEI stuff comes to mind, right? And
Yeah,
the
yeah, exactly. All kinds of identity politic silliness, because so many Republicans take abortion as such an important issue.
right.
There are many Republicans who will vote on that one issue, right?
Yes. Yes.
Very much pro-life, and so they're going to support the Republican nominee no matter what.
Right.
And in the case of Donald Trump, he didn't pretend to be all that Christian. When he was first coming to power, there was a lot of discussion. Will evangelicals rally around him? Well, the answer became yes, but with a nose clip, because it was the only game in town.
Right.
And let's face it, what a lot of folks in the Republican Party and a lot of independents and some libertarians liked about President Trump is that he was willing to say anything, do anything, didn't care about political correctness getting in his way, right? That's a lot of his shtick. Well, if you are a Christian or anybody else who believes in certain values and principles having been trod upon by modern politics, right? And generally resent a certain amount of the wokeness that seems to have squelched some of the church's role, for example.
Right.
If you recognize that as maybe not a great thing for our society, maybe that's a different podcast. But if you feel that way, well, here comes President Trump. He hates the same people you do,
Right.
and is not afraid to say, all this wokeness is stupid.
Right.
Well, if you're a Christian who believes that a certain amount of wokeness is contributing to the downfall of the church, man, I don't have to believe that Donald Trump is a great Christian. We share some enemies. He's my guy all of a sudden, right?
Right. Right.
And so that gives some of these people, by the way, we're not just talking about Donald Trump.
No,
There are
no.
some people in his administration who have adopted some Christian nationalist language that I don't like.
Yeah.
And these people have a lot of open field running in the Republican Party, because where are Christians going to go? Are you going to get so offended by Pete Hegseth's language suggesting that this war is, at least in part, justified? Now, I don't think he has actually said this, but there's a certain implication in him saying we're going to war, and kind of referencing biblical verses.
Yeah.
There's a bit of an implication that we're maybe partly justified because we're Christians and they're not.
Yeah. Yeah.
And if you're a Christian, you're in the Republican Party, and you're offended by this, what are you going to do about it? You're going to vote for a Democrat all of a sudden? Of course not.
Yeah. And, but Mike, that's what, and I want to, because I think, again, this is where I think a lot of misunderstanding comes. If I, for example, look back at the Reagan Revolution and how he was able to back, because this was never part of the Republican strategy per se until Reagan, I believe, where he said, I'm going to make an effort to capture all those religious Democrats, all those Southern Baptists and everything, because I'm the only one who will give them the space to practice their religion without government getting in the way. And that to me is slightly different. To your point, that's the okay, even if I didn't agree with a Republican to begin with, this guy is going to leave me alone when it comes to practicing my religion. I am
a little bit of libertarianism in there.
A little bit of libertarianism in there. So to that extent, I understand that part of it. What you just touched on, though, and I think what I think is the bigger danger is exactly what you said. All of a sudden, it was silly, but I can't get past it. Either you have to admit President Trump is delusional, or to allow that tweet of himself as Jesus to go out right after he got into a beef with Pope Leo. Either you have to believe he's delusional, or that his handlers, his strategists, are really playing into what I used to joke about, the MAGA belief that Donald Trump is a divine instrument. He is God's tool. And you hear this a lot with the true evangelicals, that we can ignore his divorces, we can ignore his philandering, we can ignore everything that's negative about his personality, because he is God's instrument for maintaining Christian belief in the US and indeed in the world. And when you start to see this, Pete Hegseth's Bible verses, comically quoting Samuel Jackson from the movies, and it's
from Pulp Fiction.
From Pulp Fiction, thank you. It escaped me. From Pulp Fiction, making a point of showing off.
By the way, I've been dying to ask you this. I should have asked you on the phone, not here while we're recording, but I'm going to ask you anyway. Do you think that Pete did that on purpose? Do you think that Pete knew he was quoting Pulp Fiction, or do you think he thought he was quoting the Bible or maybe some other religious text?
I think he thought. I think someone gave it to him and said, "Here's a quote that I think. Here's a Bible verse that I think plays well."
Now, or at least a quote.
Or at least
maybe the person who handed it to him knew it was Pulp Fiction, but
yeah, see,
I know that Pete wouldn't know.
I think that's the case. If I had to put money on a situation, I think it's one of his handlers. And I might even start to think that if someone really wanted to embarrass him, they start feeding him this nonsense because he is so unaware of anything, that someone may have said, "Here, read this. It's really cool." And it's
who was the comedy movie newsreader who would read anything off of the teleprompter, no matter what it was?
Will Ferrell in Anchorman.
Yeah,
Ron,
go screw yourself, Cincinnati, or something.
yeah. That if you give him something, he'll just read it and he'll do his best
So,
calling.
so it's possible. By the way, I'm not disagreeing with you,
Yeah.
but this theory is that it's possible that someone was setting up Pete.
Yes, that is the first say minority thought that hit my head, because there's still I think the more likely thing is someone gave him that and thought that Pete would know it was a Pulp Fiction quote, and he didn't, and he just played it off
And
like it
we
was
still don't know whether he did or didn't.
right. I think that's the most likely scenario, but I think there's a small percentage chance that somebody was effing with him or someone's trying to get him fired. Because what's happening now is, and when you look at Viktor Orban, and here's the transition I want to make, because I wanted to ask you
The
politically.
Hungarian leader who was just voted out and replaced by a guy named Peter Magyar.
Right, who was sort of a protege of his, right? But then decided that things had
Some
gone
time ago.
yeah, things had gone so far south in Hungary that the Christian piece of the nationalism wasn't holding together. I don't think the guy that got voted in instead of Orban, I don't think he's like a great reformer. I just think he's a nationalist who's tired of using Christian and white nationalism as that glue. And I think that's specific to the Hungary, because they were suffering economically. And I think that's what the people finally decided. Like, okay, we're all Christian, we're all happy to be white, no immigration, things like that. But we're suffering here. And maybe it's
Well,
time.
I think you're right. I think that the overlapping piece is that he was able to position himself as a little bit of a reformer, but especially someone who is skeptical of powerful institutions, and to hang them to a certain extent on his former boss, to hang them on Orban, saying, Orban's become part of the problem, and some of the reform we need is against people like Orban.
Right. And it was a stunning defeat for Orban. First of all, I don't think too many people expected he would lose. But he also got crushed in the parliament.
Certainly, I don't think many people expected him to get crushed the way he did.
Yeah, it was like his party lost 100, and the Reform Party got. Let me look at that name. Tizaz, I think it's pronounced, got 138 out of 199 seats. That is like a crushing parliamentary victory.
Crushing.
And throw in the amount of political capital and nationalism capital that the U.S. threw Orban's way.
This is what I want to ask you. What the hell were JD Vance and Marco Rubio doing supporting this guy who was not a, classical liberal in the traditional American political sense, right? That's the most positive spin I can put on it.
Right.
Was not what you would call an important leading figure on the world stage.
Right.
You could argue about that. He's not without some importance in his region. I mean, but this is not the Prime Minister of the United Kingdom, I guess is my point.
Right. It's not Putin. It's not.
Exactly. So there's two things he's not. And then the third is he's not a winner.
No.
So, I mean, those are the three things you look for, right? His power and influence, the fact that he's going to win, or ideological simpatico with your own traditions. Missing all three. What the hell is the Vice President of the United States? I mean, is JD Vance surrounded by nincompoops the same way Donald Trump is? What the hell is he doing over there campaigning for this guy?
Not only what is he doing over there campaigning.
No. That's a question.
No, I get that.
So what's the answer?
Well, I was going to say, before I give the answer, I also wanted to throw in a little bit of context. I don't know if you saw his campaign rallies for Orban. There was one where he literally said, and I have a special supporter on the phone. Let's see if we could get him. He's talking to the Hungarian crowd. And the plan was for him to call Trump and have Trump address the crowd over Vance's cell phone. So he holds the cell phone up to the mic, he dials it, and you hear, the number you have reached is disconnected. That's what went out to the crowd. you couldn't script it any better if you were a writer for like the Daily Show, right? So then he tries again, and through a couple of more clunky things, he finally gets President Trump to address the crowd. So it's Vance in person, the United States Vice President, the United States President in a live phone call after some stumbles, right? And the only reason I could think of is
on
that,
the heels of the Secretary of State having been there a few weeks earlier.
right, on the heels, right, of Rubio paying a visit there. So very clearly, rather than a strategic piece for the United States, right? I don't think anyone is sitting on pins and needles on whether Hungary is on awesome relations with us or not, right? So very clearly, this spoke more to the power of MAGA's message to me, because part of what made MAGA even more picking up momentum here in the US is, look how our ideas are spreading across the world. We've got Orban in Hungary. We've got who's the prime minister in Poland, who's a very big Trump fan, right? We had the British nationalists take over there. To some extent, Maloney in Italy, right? So part of the, if you're Trump, in at least prior to 2024, part of the power of your message was, man, our ideas are so good. Look at all the other countries that are adopting them. Look how well off even countries like Hungary and Poland are doing, because they're following the Trump playbook, baby. They're following the MAGA playbook, and now it's starting to fall apart. So I think there was a prestige cost to Orban losing, and losing so badly in Hungary. So I think, yeah, should the US have been that directly involved? No, because now you ask yourself the very practical question, how do you rebuild those relations with the new government that's in there?
Well, that's the traditional reason why you don't campaign for somebody, because
Right?
either they're going to win without you, in which case you don't need to try to add value, or it's close and they could lose, in which case you're, looking stupid. This was a colossal strategic error. Colossal strategic error. And this is one of the points I wanted to make, is that the Trump administration is misreading the reason they came to power.
Mm.
The Trump administration believes that it came to power because they're very smart and now they're spreading these ideas around the world. It's actually the opposite. The Democratic Party and the wokeism that spread around the world was naturally eventually going to have a backlash. President Trump came to power because he was the most vociferous, least tied to existing political institutions that everyone viewed as either being corrupted or at the very least had to be reformed, pushed out of our way, culturally, politically, right? And he was the one guy that everyone recognized would not be held back by the past, because
Right.
he's a bull in a china shop. He doesn't even respect the China. That makes sense. There were a lot of folks around the world who were elected in the few years preceding or following 2016 that were in the same category. This was not a Trumpian thing. This was just Trump riding a wave. I think, we should all, most people around the world recognize this. I think the White House is the last institution not to believe that that's the case.
Right.
And I think that there are a couple of ironies here. One is that of all the people in the universe, in the galaxy, who should recognize the truthfulness of what I just said, the number one guy is JD Vance. Here's a guy who compromised everything he believed in to get on the Trump train.
Right.
Right?
Right.
Why? Surely you recognize this concept of riding a wave. I mean, surely you get how this works, right?
Well, that's what's fascinating. Again, I've always said, I've always, and people will say facetiously, but I'm actually serious, Donald Trump is not a smart man, in my opinion. He's not an intelligent man, in my opinion. I think he has charm and all that fun stuff, but I would never accuse him of, like, I need a problem solved, let me go get his opinion on it. That would never be the case. JD Vance, I don't put in that category.
Right.
I think he's an intelligent man. I think he's someone who's capable, as you said, of spotting that train leaving the station and saying, I got to hop on that, or I'm going to let it go, or whatever. And I think Vance is in a different category, which is why it's so surprising to me that he
Shocking.
continues on this path 2 years into the administration. Because now Trump, under normal, and I have to say this, under normal political cycles, Trump is in the lame duck stage right now, right? He's
Yep.
about to lose the midterm elections. He's had full control for 2 years. That's going away. Anything he was going to accomplish legislatively should have been done by now, because he's entering that lame duck status. And this should be the runway where JD Vance, as the presumptive front runner for the Republican Party, is carving his own rake's path, right? He should be saying, like, I support the boss, but, maybe we spoke a little too much on this, or maybe we need to make a slight course adjustment. And ironically,
Or
Mike,
at least leave his own personal doors open to saying later, I didn't quite agree with the boss on every single point.
right, give him some sort of wiggle room, some deniability, plausible
So that
deniability.
he doesn't have to do the Kamala Harris, there's nothing I can think of that I would do differently.
Right. Excuse me. You're right. Um, and it's interesting to me that, as far as I could tell, the only political pivot slash different group is that he's trying to appeal again to the Christian base of MAGA. He's trying to appeal to the TPUSA folks. He's trying to inherit Charlie Kirk's legacy. That seems to be his main. Like with Rubio, I don't see that as much being, say, the other potential front runner for the Republican Party to take Trump's leadership.
I agree with you, and yet Marco Rubio is over there supporting Orban as well. And so I'd like to draw a distinction between those two things. I think that Vance and Rubio believe that if they can make the case for Orban, they're making the case for Trumpism and therefore making the case for themselves. In other words, a more broad, to John's point, a more broadly nationalistic view of the world.
Right.
Even if it's not Christian nationalism, it's nationalism,
Right.
which Marco Rubio is all about.
Absolutely.
All about, right?
Absolutely. Yeah, agreed.
He's going to get all of the nationalism, but not Christian nationalism lane if JD Vance takes all of the Christian nationalism
That's the
lane.
distinction. I think that's the distinction I was trying to make. Thank you for
Yes, and let's come back to that.
Yeah.
I think it was a colossal political error, both in the short run and in the long run. And I think that it illustrates the fact that, as I said earlier, there's a big difference between Christianity and Christian nationalism.
Yes.
And, you have all this running room when you surround yourself with Christians, because where else are they going to go? Right. And you surround yourself with Christian nationalists because they're all pushing you from the back. So you think you're the cat's meow. And you get out there and you get ahead of your skis, and all of a sudden you say something stupid. Who is eventually going to give you push? If the Democratic Party is not attracting enough evangelical Christians, and the Republican Party is going to support you, therefore, because they have nowhere else to go, and you're surrounding yourself with nationalists abroad, and you have a bunch of atheists in Europe and in Asia, right, in communists, there's no one to give you any pushback until finally one day there's this son of a gun from South Chicago who's a White Sox fan, and I'm going to have to forgive him. I believe in forgiveness. I'm going to cut him some slack for being a White Sox fan. As a Cubs fan, that has bothered me tremendously. All of a sudden, there's this kid from Chicago who understands a couple of things that I don't know that most popes have. He gets Donald Trump, for starters. Because it's not easy to understand Donald Trump unless you either grew up in New York like you did or Chicago like I did.
And what's interesting is we're talking about Pope Leo, of course. The
Leo the
first
14th.
Leo the 14th, the first American pope. Now, ordinarily, you would think that distinction would come with, oh, I'm integrating the American cultural ethos into the Vatican, perhaps a little bit better. I'm allowing Americans to explore their faith a little bit better. It's a new age of relationships between the Vatican and the U.S.
You might have thought so.
You might have thought so. No, Pope Leo the 14th's first task as the first American pope is to say, I know what Donald Trump's really about, and none of it is good. None of it
In
aligns.
fairness, he didn't quite put it the way you just did.
I'm paraphrasing, right?
He's a
But
little more diplomatic than that.
he's a lot more diplomatic. But I think this, to me, is that fault line you were describing between nationalism, Christian nationalism, and Christianity, right? So, first of all, let's start out with the beef itself. Pope Leo, and again, I'll simplify it. Hopefully, I'll catch the spirit better this time, Mike. Pope Leo basically said the Iran war is an unjust war. It's an unjustified war. It's an unjust war. Immediately, you have beef. The first beef came from Trump, basically saying Pope Leo's weak on crime and he really doesn't get it.
Which I think goes in the same category as you're ugly.
Right. Basically,
Because I just don't see, the Pope saying, "Ooh, I'm weak on crime. That matters."
Right. Or we expect the Pope to be for the death penalty and such. But regardless, you're right. That's
Right. Like he used to be a Chicago detective or something.
Right. That's like a typical Trump response. I get it. But it is a fault line, maybe a minor one. What I think was perhaps the least considered response was JD Vance's, who in essence tried to out Augustinian the Pope, who is an Augustinian from the Augustinian tradition, right? Here's JD Vance coming along, a converted Catholic, as I understand it, recently, I think in 2017
Yes.
or 2019. And the old rule of converts being the most zealous, right? Because it must have taken a lot to get them to convert, you would assume. He's trying to instruct the Pope on St. Augustine's principles and the just war theory. Mike, religious debate aside, from a political point of view, from the point of view of showing perhaps what is actually under pressure in the environment, how smart was it of both President Trump and Vice President Vance to pick a fight with Pope Leo?
There are almost no words to describe the political malpractice of arguing with an American Pope about theology. There are almost no, I can't even think of an example. It would be up there with, I know, push record on the tape recorder while we discuss burglarizing the Watergate Hotel. It would have to be that moronic, right? There's no way someone smart enough to get himself elected president of the United States could do anything that stupid unless you were either Donald Trump, JD Vance, or Richard Nixon. There's just no way outside of those three that anyone could have done anything this dumb.
Yeah.
And again, it goes to either an absence of voices around them or just the absence of smart voices around them. I do believe that Vance's comment about the Pope needs to be careful when discussing theology was so abjectly stupid that I think he misspoke. I'm going to stand up for JD here in this case. I think he actually miswrote or misspoke that. I don't think that's what he meant. I think what he meant was, and I don't know this for sure, but look, he graduated from the best law school in the world, so, or at least the most difficult to get into law school in the world. So he's got to be smarter than this. I think what he meant was, when the Pope's discussing theology, he needs to be careful to stick to theology and not wade into American foreign policy.
Which is probably the stock answer every administration has for this situation, right? Because you're always going to butt heads with the Pope or other religious leaders on your foreign or domestic policies, right? It's just inevitable.
And there is an irony in suggesting that someone should be careful while you're handling it in a ham-handed fashion.
Of course. But the question I wanted to ask you um, is this sort of like that does this pressure, that distinction you were making between Christianity and Christian nationalism, does this sort of little vignette between the Pope and the administration, does it force that portion of Trump Trump's base to say, wait a second, we're Christians here, to the extent that some may be Catholics even, right? Um, the Pope just made a point that maybe this war isn't justified. If we have a disagreement, it should be on whether or not the war is justified, not whether or not the Pope is correct in deciding that only justified war should be pursued, right? Like there's a
Right.
difference. If you have an objection as a Christian, it should be whether or not the war itself is justified. If you're a Christian nationalist, your objection is probably like, why is the Pope telling my president what to do?
I think that is very well said. I think it highlights, I think that point highlights how dumb it is for the administration to be arguing with the Pope.
Right.
If you were you hit the nail on the head when you said the stock answer, right? Presidents have had to deal with this for centuries.
Right.
Literally, leaders around the world have had to deal with popes for centuries, millennia, literally, have had to learn how to say, the Pope and I see this differently. He's got his lane, I've got mine. And you
Yeah.
find nice ways of saying that. Sometimes these guys are better at it than others. In this particular situation, well, look, it could be worse.
Right.
If the Pope were an evangelical
Mm.
instead of a Catholic, this would be a nightmare for the administration. It's mitigated by the fact that there are a lot of evangelicals who don't spend a whole lot of energy worrying about what the Pope says.
Of course. Yeah.
I'm one of the few who grew up in an evangelical Lutheran church, having been co-raised by a Calvinist, but by quirk of the stars, have spent an enormous amount of time in the Catholic Church growing up.
Right.
Mostly because, where I went to college, it was the only game in town. You'll enjoy this, John. There on campus we had the Christian Center. It was non-denominational, run by a priest.
Yes.
Okay, so you get it.
I went to a Jesuit university, so I get it. Yeah.
Yeah, so, you get it. You can take the name off the wall, but
Exactly.
there's no such thing as a self-respecting Jesuit who's going to pretend he's not. Okay,
Right.
that just isn't going to happen.
Right.
So anyway, most of my evangelical friends, recent co-parishioners, don't listen too much to the Pope. And to be honest, I don't spend a lot of energy myself worrying
Right.
about what the Pope says about theology. I'm kind of curious what the Pope says ironically, more in a political context because of his enormous influence. And then in this particular case, and this is another point worth making, being the first American to serve in this role, I'm curious, as I know you are, does that mean he's going to say things maybe slightly differently or have a little bit different perspective? I've been fascinated by the extent to which he's been like 88% Pope and 12% American lately,
Yeah.
bringing the Vatican to America more than the other way around.
Right.
And as someone who respects the church's need to institutionalize its purpose in life,
Right.
I respect that the Pope behaves in this way. So you've got this interesting and unusual circumstance where you have an American Pope, and even though he's not evangelical, there are going to be a lot of Americans who are curious to see what this guy says and maybe even gives him a little bit more deference than they normally would. And instead of even coming up with a stock answer, as John just said, what you should have come up with is a way to embrace the Pope. A deft politician should have been kissing this guy's ass from the moment he became Pope. From
Yeah.
the moment the white smoke came out, you should have been kissing this guy's ass. That doesn't mean you need to agree with everything,
Right.
but you need to be showing respect. And if you're good at it, and I truly believe that they're not, but if you were good at being a white, I accidentally said white, I meant Christian nationalist or white nationalist, if you were actually good at it,
Oh, you would
and
have
you really
leveraged.
wanted to be good at manipulating Christians,
You would have leveraged this, no doubt. You would have
of
leveraged.
course you would leverage this.
Yeah.
You know, he's from Chicago and he's an American and we have so much in common. I was just on the phone with him, right? I was
Yeah.
just on the phone with Pope Leo XIV, and, you know, we agreed on so much. And it makes me so proud of my own heritage and his. And then I talked to him again a month later, you know, oh, we're on the phone together all the time. That way, when eventually you have a disagreement,
Right.
right? It's in the context of I listen to him, he listens to me, he has a role, I have a role. We see this a little bit differently, but I'm not running the risk of disrespecting him. I'm mitigating the damage if he says something that sounds like it might disrespect me, because you know
Right.
people are going to view that differently if we have a strong relationship, and therefore I get to hang on to all my Catholic voters.
Mike, not only do you get to build the credibility with your own Catholic voters, you're also now, you have to worry about your allies who happen to be Catholic nations. The good example there is Meloni in Italy. She basically told Trump to take a walk, and it's not like Meloni wasn't riding Trump's coattails all along. She was, but basically over this Pope beef, she basically said, "Hey, you're on this on your own. We're not dealing with Iran." And just more broadly, the MAGA influence. The UK said, "Hey, we're not joining your Iran nonsense." Canada basically cut a deal with China on the economic front. So let me just sort of kind of wrap this up a little bit. Do you think that recent political events, Orban, Maloney, uh, the UK, Canada, breaking in to some degree, breaking with Trump's MAGA direction? Do you think this bodes well, A, for MAGA, and B, more generally, perhaps, for the Christian nationalist movement in this country? Do you feel that these are signs of pressure cracks, that there's got to be a release happening soon?
I think it opens up an opportunity for Christians to be Christian. And by that, I mean, I'm really glad you brought up the Maloney example. I think
Mm,
it's really instructive in ways that fly under the American radar just slightly. Maloney's relationship with the Pope is not completely dissimilar to what the White House's relationship should be with the Pope. In other words, they have
mm,
a special relationship with the Pope by virtue of the Vatican being in Rome and Rome being in Italy.
right.
So Italy is not the Catholic country that it used to be. Let's be honest. Culturally, by heritage, absolutely. By
Yeah.
faith, not as much as it used to be. That doesn't mean it's, you know, no longer a nation of faith. I'm not going there. But
It's not
it's
a state-sanctioned religion. I get what you're saying. Yeah,
yeah,
it's not like
it's not the way it used. It's, you know,
yeah,
they're not as bad as the French, but you know, it's not the way it used to be. Okay. When she took the Pope's side in this little tiny spat between the Pope and Donald Trump, she got a big boost in popularity.
mhm,
And that's not all because of their form of Christian nationalism. It's not all because of their form of Christianity. It's just he's a popular guy there. You know, you don't go to England and disrespect the Fab Four,
mhm,
right? Or the Rolling Stones.
right.
Now, you can try to position yourself as a rock and roll aficionado, but when you're over there disrespecting the Beatles and then someone gets mad, hey, that's on you. You just played that one wrong. You know, you didn't read the room.
Shouldn't be a surprise. Shouldn't be a
And
surprise.
Maloney did. And so when we all of a sudden have an American Pope and the Italian prime minister takes his side against the American president's, and her popularity boosts, we have played that wrong because he's our guy. He's a Chicago guy.
Mm.
You get my point.
I
Is
do.
that they just played this wrong. And I think that that gives an opportunity for people to say, maybe the Pope's not my guy, right? Maybe the Pope's not my guy, but he's got a point.
Right.
And that's the only window you need. Because now when the Pope says there is such a thing as a just war and not a just war, you don't have to agree with every syllable that comes out of his pie hole.
Right.
But all of a sudden, you're thinking, right? To your point, in an Augustinian way, all of a sudden you're thinking, well, maybe he does have a point. And maybe it's not true that as a Christian, I need to support everything the Republican Party does. Maybe it's possible that I can be a good Christian. I can look for opportunities to advance my principles, including pro-life and anti-abortion.
Right.
I can look for politicians who support a worldview that dovetails with mine. And I don't have to eat all this BS about the war in Iran having been justified because we're a Christian nation.
Right.
Those fault lines, those cracks really matter. Let me offer another example.
Sure.
That's not Christian nationalism and not related to the war.
Okay.
When important economists say tariffs are stupid, not just Mike Tremont, but, important economists, right?
Real economists.
Careful. When real economists say
Right.
tariffs are stupid, it gives you permission to think what you have always thought.
Right.
You don't have to be in the business of changing your mind just because you're in the Republican Party and all of a sudden your president says, forget everything you learned the last 50 years. Now tariffs are a good idea. And everyone, oh, yes, tariffs are a good idea. When important economists say, no, the basic principles of economics that we have understood for a century
Right.
still hold. It gives you permission to, you're right. What was I thinking? And it should be that way with Christians in this day and age. We need our leaders. Again, not me. We need our theological leaders, our Christian community leaders, whether those are our pastors at a local level or the Pope in the Catholic Church. We need folks to have the cojones to say, look, people, I appreciate you all supporting the Republican Party because, we look for our principles of supporting life to be advanced in every realm, including politics. That's all good. That doesn't mean you need to eat this crap about invading Iran because Pete Hegseth is quoting the Bible once in a while.
Right. And I think that's a perfect way to look at it. And I actually wonder now if in desperate mode prior to the midterms, if this distinction between Christianity and Christian nationalism continues to build, the pressure, a fault line continues to expand, because if I was, and I'm assuming based on what I know about evangelical movements and faiths, that if someone put up a portrait of himself as Jesus, I might take offense to that, no matter who it was. Because at the end of the day, if it was Kathy Griffin who had done it and said, look at me, I'm female Jesus healing the sick,
we would have slaughtered her.
You would have slaughtered her culturally, of course, no violence.
Yeah, I apologize. That was a poor choice of words.
That's okay. But you're absolutely right. She would have been maligned. She would have been used as a political talking point. So now my challenge would be to the evangelical supporters of Donald Trump. Can you justify him portraying himself as Jesus? Can you justify a beef with the Pope, not based on the fact that he's a Catholic, he may not share your faith, your particular sect of Christianity, but because of because he didn't agree with President Trump. Do you agree that there's just and unjust wars? If that's okay with you, then your decision isn't whether Donald Trump agrees with it. Your decision is whether this is just or unjust. And I think that, in my opinion, I kind of see this now building. I think between what happened with Maloney, I think what happened with the Pope, and I don't know, Mike, my read on the Pope is he's not going to get more and more quiet over things as they occur. Like, I think if the Iran war escalates, if other nations are drawn into it, he'll have more to say. And I think you'll have continued beef. And I don't know. In some ways, I'm glad to see this pressure, to be honest with you, because I think if you're really a Christian, your first allegiance should be to your faith, should be to your principles, not to your party, not to a party. And
I think that that's the way it is. And I think that the distinction will become more and more important.
Yep, that's a good way of putting it. I think as we go forward, that distinction will become an issue. I think it'll become an issue in 2028, and I think it'll be an issue in November this year.
Because a lot of folks supported Donald Trump because he was anti-war, ostensibly, at least recently, pro-life.
Right.
And he was against too much of the BS of government interventionism in our lives and in our economy. And
Right.
here he is supporting tariffs and war in Iran. And I think there's going to be a lot of Republicans, myself included, who say, look, you were supported for X, Y, and Z. If X, Y, and Z aren't true anymore.
Yep, exactly. All right, everyone. Thank you for joining us today on Liberty Lens. I appreciate you taking the time to listen to us. Hit the subscribe button, hit the like button. It really helps us out with the YouTube algorithm. For Mike Termott and myself, Big John, until next week, peace, everyone.